Well, it seems to me that first of all, that our present sort of geopolitical framework is essentially the result of our reactions to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, that was the beginning of a new chapter, it seems to me. And obviously, if you have anything as stupendous as the collapse of the Soviet Union and its withdrawal from the middle of Europe, it changes the whole geopolitical framework, and both the Americans and the Europeans were forced to rethink to reimagine their strategic position, their basic strategies, and so on in the world. And I think that is the beginning of the present story, because I think the Europeans and the Americans really interpreted these events in quite different ways, and the result, and that then feeds into their new strategic vision of things. In the case of the Europeans, they presumed that the end of the Soviet Union meant not a unipolar world, which was the American idea. There were two poles, one fell down, now there's only one, but rather a plural world. And I don't know how self-conscious this was, but this is sort of embodied in what they then did, which is to say we need a much stronger European Union, which can act, which can stand on its own, not breaking with America, but adopting more of a position of equality. And this involved, the great result of this was the Maastricht Treaty. I suppose you could say the other great result was the euro, which people have been talking about for a long time, but they finally got around to doing after the collapse of the Soviets. But anyway, Maastricht, you can say there never really was a peace treaty with Germany. It wasn't possible because of the division of Germany, which nobody was willing to accept as a permanent, or rather the Germans were not willing to accept as a permanent state of affairs. And once Germany had been unified, then it became both necessary and possible in a way to stabilize some new European arrangement, which I think is what Maastricht was. We didn't really appreciate it, I think. Maybe because it made us nervous, but we said it's rather provincial. It's only dealing with Europe, whereas our vision by this time was talking about the global system in America as a kind of world hegemon and so on. But of course, Maastricht was extremely important, and it is the germ of a European Union that becomes a world player, which I think has gradually evolved, maybe not far enough. Well, I think that's true, but that's all the more reason to resolve some of these problems. On the one hand, the American policy toward either Russia or the Islamic world has essentially been rather confrontational. We began by enlarging NATO very early on. That was in the Clinton administration in, 92, 93. The president, in effect, began inviting people into NATO, and it wasn't just the Visegrad countries and some of the Balkan countries, but former parts of the Soviet Union, like the Baltic states or Ukraine. And this predictably infuriated the Russians. Not the way if you were trying to set out to build a new relationship with Russia on the grounds that it was a new Russia and you wanted to bring it into a sort of larger European family. This was hardly the way to do it, surrounded with allies and military bases and so on. So that wasn't very helpful from a European point of view. Which doesn't mean that there aren't numerous European countries whose only view of this was, well, Russia's a menace, what used to be a menace still is, and we're very lucky to have the Americans there to protect us. I mean, I think much of this could have been done. I don't think the Russians really objected to Poland, for example, being in NATO. I mean, it's sort of inevitable. But going into the old Soviet Union and doing it all in such a rush, I mean, was, I think, unwise and not in Europe's interest. I mean, similarly with the Islamic world, the American approach is rather confrontational. And I mean, whereas Europe is very much in the, I mean, a basic policy, to use an unpopular word, you can call it appeasement, but meaning something quite sensible, which is you try to find out what's making people unhappy and see if you can't do something about it. That's different from the American approach, which is to build up enough force so that the people who aren't happy you can keep down. And the fact is that these parts of the world are Europe's neighbors, and therefore Europe has a much greater interest in good relations with this part of the world than the United States. After all, they're an ocean away. So that suggests that Europe ought to have the ability to have more independent policies and really to shape Western policy toward these parts of the world. Really needs to for its own sake, and relying on the United States is not a very convincing strategy at this point of view because of this hostility and this whole approach of the Americans, which probably it reflects the fact that we're not here. Well, I mean, the living standard argument, there's nothing very original in that, but it seems to me inevitably Western living standards are under threat from competition, which is much cheaper, wages which are much lower, and so all the rest of it. And this particularly comes to mind when you start talking about China and its very rapid growth and so on. China has a right to develop, and it's going to assert that right. But on the other hand, there are people who are going to be hurt rather badly in the West because the difference in wages is enormous. What's supposed to happen is the wages sort of equalize. Well, it's a very long fall from Western wages to speak very crudely about these things, it's a long fall from Western level wages to Chinese level wages, and if you come out somewhere in the middle, it will be a very unhappy time for a lot of people. This won't happen, it seems to me. I mean, there will be a political explosion before this happens. And what would be useful is if we sat down and we just began thinking seriously about, how can we reconcile these things? The fact that the Chinese are going to grow, they have a right to. But how do we adjust to this in the West, aside from something which we know we're not going to do, which will be extremely difficult for Western labor, particularly. So. That's one thing. I think often the Commission has not emphasized enough what seems to me ought to be its role, which is somehow or other to reconcile free trade, the efficiencies of this kind of free market, with some sense of communal responsibility that workers are protected and that you have a society where people are not abandoned, and all that is the Commission ought to be seen as the guardian of that. I don't think it is at the moment, and it's partly for this rather bad habit of spouting sort of 19th century free trade at people. without any corresponding emphasis upon social welfare. And I think this perhaps is responsible for the plummeting popularity of the EU with the general public. It's because they don't think it's performing a function which is vitally of interest to them.